to season 2 of A Dram and a Drash. This season, I've already been working on the first half of the season, lining up some upcoming guests, and I'm really excited at the variety that we're going to have in the coming months. I'll get to this month's guest in just a moment, but just some upcoming highlights. We're going to be meeting a Reform rabbi serving the Jewish community of Belarus. We're going to be meeting a cantor specializing in world music and Yiddish folk dance. And we're going to be meeting a author and writer who has made her way into the whiskey tasting world. All of them have incredible stories to tell, and I'm looking forward to bringing them all to you. And of course, as is our format for A Dram and a Drash, always with an introductory dram, an opportunity to learn a little bit about a whiskey. And a balance throughout these episodes between episodes where the focus is more on the world of whiskey versus episodes where we start with a whiskey and then the rest of the drush is learning about some wonderful aspect of Jewish life and culture. So I hope you'll enjoy the variety and come along for the journey. Our first guest for season 2 is Joshua Mann. Now, whiskey is not his day job, but his hobby is very much a second job that he has embraced with such passion. Josh is the founder of Jews and Booze, which is an online community of whiskey enthusiasts, and in recent years they've put out a number of single barrel picks, private label bottling, and Joshua also hosts tasting events all over the Northeast. More recently, with his brother, he's gone into business and launched the First Cut Barrel Company, which is based out of Stamford, Connecticut, and designed to give people the opportunity to design and customize their own single barrel experience. I was very excited that when I invited Joshua to be a guest on the podcast, he invited me to come down to the warehouse so that we could do an on-location recording. So this month is very much focused on the experience of whiskey, making whiskey, choosing whiskey, and I'm going to let Josh tell us all about it. So, welcome, Joshua Mann. Welcome to A Dram and a Drash. It is really exciting to be in an on-location recording opportunity here with Joshua Mann of First Cut Barrel Company and also of Jews and Booze. We're going to get right into what's your first dram of the day, and then we'll take it from there. We have a lot to talk about, most of it about whiskey today.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Rabbi Rachel. Excited to be here. And before we start getting into it, why don't we pour our first dram? This is a 95% rye, 5% malted barley mash bill. It's a straight rye from MGP, which is a big distillery out in Indiana. And this will be, in a couple of weeks, it will be 8 years old. So almost 8 rye. And so rye, as you know, is somewhat considered to be America's original spirit, if you don't count rum. But l'chaim.
L'chaim. Yes, that coming into the Northeast, that was what grew. That's the whole upstate New York. There's a whole revival, and now a whole genre of Empire Rye, which is very specifically from certain parts of New York. Yeah, it's only when we started to move south and rye didn't grow so well that we got into corn and hence bourbon. But that's right, geography and climate and ecology matters when it comes to what your whiskey's made out of.
Also, I would say the economy. I mean, all of a sudden we have this abundance of corn in this country, from corn syrup to everything else, and they needed something to make the whiskey out of. So they had this raw product right there.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what happened in the Highlands of Scotland, right? They were growing grains, and they could actually use it to barter, to pay their taxes, pay the landlord, and do more with it when they turned the excess that they didn't need to survive and eat into a product.
Okay. Yeah, this particular barrel I feel is kind of unique. It's way sweeter than a typical rye. I mean, I could see people drinking this and thinking it's a bourbon because of the butterscotch notes and the caramel that you don't necessarily usually the spiciness and the pepperiness of the rye kind of takes over in a whiskey like this. But you get a lot of the sweetness too.
Let's give it a go. Oh yeah, no. You just said lots of caramel. Yeah, and there's some cocoa notes, some nutty notes in there. Yeah.
And on the tail end, I almost get just a little bit of coffee.
Mm-hmm. Like a dark, black coffee. Yes. And I think, there's a softness to it, which you don't always get, which you said this is a 7-year rye.
Almost 8 years, and a few weeks will be 8.
Right. So I know that sometimes when you're, you let, ryes or bourbons just sit that a little bit longer. Sometimes it takes some of the brightness out. Sometimes it becomes a little flabby and flat, but it also kind of smooths out those edges. You're getting some of that too.
Yeah, and you know what? Sometimes you also risk it becoming a bit too astringent from the wood. But I think that this doesn't do that. I think that this is still in the barrel, so but I think it's coming along very well.
Right. Well, thank you. It's a great way to start. We're going to be talking a lot more about First Cut Barrel Company, what you're doing with this distillate straight from barrels, why we're sitting in a warehouse surrounded by barrels here. But this is not up until recently been what the day job is. So tell us a little bit about your background, who you are, how you got into an appreciation that really has become a passion for all things whiskey.
Yes, I would say so. So really, my background is in public health and healthcare. I've really dedicated my life to cancer research and working with cancer patients, especially rare cancers. And whiskey was never really even on my radar. I never drank hard liquor in college or anything like that. One day, my wife was in Brookline. She was picking up a bottle of wine for somebody, and they had a charity raffle. And I don't even think she knew what was being raffled off, but she supported the charity, so she got a raffle ticket, and then we ended up winning. And again, she didn't really care, so she gave it to me to go pick something, and I start looking through the list, and I didn't know any of this stuff. I really didn't know there was such a thing as whiskey raffles or rare whiskey or anything like that.
Everything in the raffle was whiskey.
Oh yeah, it was a rare whiskey raffle.
Okay.
What I later found out. And so I started doing a little research, and I found this whole underground community that I had no idea existed. And I started learning a little bit more and more, and I started tasting a little bit and looking for advice from people on to understand what this is. And pretty soon I started really going for it, between collecting and buying and selling and trying to stay up on all the new releases and all the fun things that are around. I found it to be especially during COVID when everyone was isolated in their homes, I found this to be a very positive social outlet.
Right, because you could still talk to people, you could still taste and have those experiences. I think that was when I shifted from somebody who was just sort of a casual enjoyer of certain things to, again, finding the community in all kinds of settings, whether it was, Facebook groups or Zoom connections or even, some of the new social media forums that people were trying just to create community to talk to each other. Some showing up in some of those and finding that there were people talking about whiskey, and it was a thing you could continue to do, perhaps because bizarrely, at least in Massachusetts where we both live, the liquor stores were considered essential services. That might not have been the case, and that goes back to an interesting history of whiskey and its connections to perceived medical benefits, at least at the time when there wasn't something better available. But anyway, so that makes sense that was a time when, and I've been to your whiskey storage space in your home, so I know how seriously you take the collecting. It's puts my little small modest collection to shame.
And I will say one of the nice things was I mean, since COVID, maybe even a little bit before COVID, it seems like everything nowadays is so polarizing. Everything is political and it's us versus them, no matter what the issue. And this whole whiskey thing felt like a refuge for me from that because there was a total absence of all that.
Yeah.
There was such camaraderie and everyone was just so friendly and nice and accepting, and it really felt like a wonderful community.
Right. On the whole, right. Every now and again, you get someone who,
of course,
makes fun of this person's choice, that person's choice, and usually these communities tell them in no short order that that's not what the community is about. But I do like that about it, and it's actually one of the concepts behind this podcast. The idea that you sit down with someone, you have a little dram, and that just sort of gets things flowing, and then the conversations come, and the conversations sort of, the whiskey is enjoyable and interesting, but the conversations are rich and can take us to other places in terms of the things that we might talk about and actually have a real conversation about them, rather than, as you said, kind of put down our poles and say, this is my side and this is your side. And whiskey historically has a role in doing that. The clans in Scotland used to, if they had major disagreements, would get their clan heads together, put them somewhere with some whiskey between them and get them to hash it out until peace had been made. I know it's a little romanticized, but that was actually a ritualized thing that they did with whiskey being an important part of it.
I think it has to do with starting out from a point of mutual respect. We're starting out having nothing to do with anything else other than the shared interest, and from there we could really explore areas that we can relate to each other or even disagree with each other, but it starts from a place of respect.
I love that. So, as I said, we are here in First Cut Barrel Company, but it's a big, well, for some of us, for me, at least conceptually, it's a big leap from, I enjoy learning about whiskey, I like trying all different genres. If there's a genre that I've not experienced yet, it's, I'm going to put it on the list to see what that one's like, to then go from that to start putting out whiskey under a label, which of course, for those who haven't met Joshua, and I know some people listening are already longtime followers and consumers of his whiskey label, Jews and Booze. Give us the backstory there. How'd that come about?
Well, so like I said, I found this community. And what I quickly realized was that there was a lot of Schwartzes, a lot of Goldsteins, a lot of Jewish names and Jewish involvement. I don't know anything about their religious observance. I just noticed these names and people who had a lot in common with me. And so I thought, well, why don't we start a little group for Jews and Booze? I thought it would be kind of I didn't know what it was going to be, but I thought it would be a funny online space for like-minded people to be able to chat and share, things that they could relate with each other.
And roughly when was this? How long ago?
This was in November of 2020.
Okay.
So right when COVID was going full force.
Right.
And from there, I didn't really even know what to expect. It was really a few dozen people in the beginning, but very quickly it exploded. I don't know exactly why, but from the beginning, a big component of what we were doing was community and tzedakah. This was never a money-making venture. I didn't even know what this was going to be, but money-making never really entered the picture, except that I've been involved with some incredible organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish, in Israel and in the US. And this was a way for me, I don't make millions of dollars, so this was a way for me to contribute. Mm-hmm. And not just me, but I was able to harness this amazing network of great people, like-minded people, good people to do good in the world.
It's a great way to use something that's pleasurable. So often that's what people who do golf tournaments, right? They love to play golf, but let's take the hobby that we have, the passion we have, and direct it into something where we can do some good in the world. So that's how it came about. So I don't know if you want to introduce another pour or talk a little bit more about...
Well, so the reason why I did the 95.5 first was because I have this Jews and Booze bottle. So we started doing barrel picks of whiskey. So we'll pick the entire barrel, we private label it or whatever. But I decided from the beginning we're going to do a funny, shticky theme with each one. I mean, we're Jews and Booze after all. So this was one that was very popular. Everyone knows New Kids on the Block. So this is New Yids on the Block.
Right.
This was an amazing 95.5 rye, just like the one we just tried. And people loved it. And so it really also kind of got me exploring things and trying new things. And I've really, listen, the whiskey world is quite the rabbit hole. And if you want to dig, you can keep digging as long as you're willing to go. That's sort of how I ended up here.
Right. And I think one of the things that does, aside from the very interesting choices that you've made in terms of what you've sourced, how it's barrel finished, we'll get into talking about Israeli whiskey, which I've featured a couple of times in season 1 of the podcast, but I know you've got a great relationship with M&H in Tel Aviv, is that these labels and the designs on the labels that really, stand out of the pack and are entertaining and fun. And I think that's been like your creativity, right?
Yeah, I mean, things that I think are funny that I hope other people can relate to a little bit.
Okay. So you want us to have a comparison of this with what we first tasted.
So this is a very similar barrel, but as you can see here, this was bottled for Juice and Booze, so white labeled for Juice and Booze, and that was a big part of the genesis of how we ended up with First Cut. I knew that this was exciting to me. I knew this was a passion, and I knew how amazing it was to be able to get to sort of design my own whiskey, from the whiskey itself to the labeling, the bottling, the distribution. I got to do it all. It was an outlet for my creativity that in my normal life I don't really get that much.
Right.
And so my brother and I were talking, and my brother works in real estate. I work in healthcare, so there's not a ton of overlap in what we do. But we were talking, and we said, "Wow, this is such a fun, unique, exclusive experience." But I happen to be well connected, and that's how I was able to make it happen. But what if we could make this experience available to everybody? If you're an individual who loves whiskey, or a kiddish club, or a veterans group, or an alumni group, or any kind of group that has a sense of belonging, camaraderie, this is an amazing thing to do. It's a fun experience that at the end of the day, you get this amazing product that it's not like a bottle of wine that you open and then you have to use within a few days. I mean, this bottle will last forever, an everlasting memory that actually you get to taste.
So this is giving First Cut Barrel company is giving people an opportunity to have that experience of purchasing their own barrel. There's a number of different ways to do that, and then choosing a bottle design, designing a label, and putting it out there. So at the end, you might have a run of, depending on what barrel you have, anywhere from like 65 to a couple of hundred bottles of something to distribute. Mm-hmm. So that there's a lot of steps involved in what goes into a bottle, and in it being a pleasant, good experience in terms of, and clearly you've tasted enough and tried enough and put out enough onto Juice and Booze that you have some idea of what makes a quality whiskey that somebody would be proud to pour into somebody's glass. So take us through the process a little bit.
Yeah, well, why don't we start? We'll pour another pour here. So this is an Indiana bourbon from MGP. A lot of people think bourbon has to be made in Kentucky, but just has to be made in the U.S. This is their high rye recipe. So it's 60% corn, 36% rye, 4% malted barley, just a smidge of malted barley to kickstart the fermentation. This is just over 7 years old, and it's my favorite mash bill out there. In fact, the best bourbon in the world that was rated by the World Whiskies Awards in 2023 was a 4-year-old version of this. So it's I think it's delicious. It's a nice complexity and
quite a different nose to the first one. The first one was just packed full of, as you say, that fruit and that spice, and this is much more vanilla, a little more subtle.
So I don't know who taught you to do tastings, but when I was originally taught, the guy who taught me told me to go from your left nostril to your right nostril. He didn't really give me a good explanation why, but I think it's because he's Israeli and he Hebrew left to right. I think he might have been putting me on, but I still go with it just in case.
I love that. Yes, I think that there may be something to that.
The Israelis know.
You know, it's funny. Everybody has their own way, and I'm going to be in this season interviewing somebody else coming up, Lisa Shapiro, who, having led people through tastings, has also a very clear sense of how to provide a tasting experience. Last season, we had Jeff Schwartz, the whiskey fellow, on, who puts out reviews of so many whiskeys, and he has a very distinct way of tasting, which includes actually like sucking air in to sort of get another level of things that he might not pick up with the initial nosing before he tastes it. Everybody does it differently. You know, experiment, see what works for you, but let's see what it tastes like. I see what you mean about that balance. You know, this is something that I would identify as a bourbon, but that punch of that rye makes it, you know, it's not sweet. Usually for me, just because I started life in the Scotch world, I've come to really appreciate all of the genres. But whereas I will almost always have Scotch neat, when it comes to bourbon, when I'm having it at home, I have these little kind of globe molds, and I like to chill it because of the sweetness that is bourbon compared to Scotch. That's just, you know, the journey I was on, and what I'm used to. I'll bring down the temperature. But something like this, when you've got the rye and the spices and a different, you're not getting that cloying sweetness at all. It doesn't need it.
Yeah.
It really doesn't need it. I might just put just a little drop of water in just to open it up a little bit. So what do you appreciate about this particular pour?
I like the complexity. I mean, so often in bourbon you get just like that punch of sweetness and corn, but not a ton of complexity, not a whole lot else going on. I think with Scotch a lot more, it's much more nuanced than a lot of bourbons.
Yeah.
But then when you have something like this, that rye, I think really gives it something else that gives you something to look forward to. It's not just that punch of sweet.
Right. And I'm getting, as it's got a nice last to it as well. So there was that initial, I've got like more than one thing going on in my mouth. But now that it's sort of gone and I'm just tasting the after, I'm also getting a little bit more of the leather and the oak, the sort of at the end there, which is, but not in an abrasive way, just in one of those layers that you would want to find. It's the contribution of the barrel. Yeah.
One of the things I always look for in picking a barrel is mouthfeel. I love like a really oily, viscous whiskey, something that has a lot of legs. So when you swirl it around, you see. That's something that I look for. It's one of those things that you can't just artificially create. I mean, the only thing that makes that is time in the barrel.
Right.
I think that when people try like a Pappy or one of these like super exclusive whiskeys, in my opinion, a lot of people will debate me on this, but I don't always necessarily think the flavor is there, but the mouthfeel is there. And I think that's why people always gravitate to barrels like that or whiskeys like that.
Right. The Weller lineup as well. Yeah, there is something, I think it's partly to do with the wheat that's creating some of that, as well as obviously age. And but yes, I've had an opportunity to try the Pappy whiskeys, and I'm kind of glad I can't afford them. I would not run after them compared to the richness that is out there, that is more available and more affordable, and people doing really interesting things with whiskey. There's a lot more that we can do than run after the rare and sought after.
And I think that speaks a lot to what our goal was with First Cut in creating this, was that we see the whiskey itself as the paint, right? Rembrandt didn't make his own paint. He took the paint that somebody else made and used it to make a masterpiece. And I find, or my brother and I have discussed this, and it's something that we believe, we're never going to be able to learn how to make whiskey compared to somebody who's been doing it for, decades, who's an expert, who's been doing it for generations. By the time we figure it out, it's, we've already missed our opportunity. So we've made a conscious decision to, instead of doing that, we want to be the painter. We want to be the artist. We want to take something that's made incredibly well and put it together in a way that the manufacturer of the paint couldn't necessarily do themselves. But because of our combined experience and palettes and tastes, we're able to take it and make it into something special by using blending and oak barrels and finishing and all these different ways to make whiskey, take it from amazing to exceptional.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because what we have behind us are a variety of barrels. Some of them here have already had other things in them, and so they're finishing barrels. Some of them are new oak barrels, as they need to be for making bourbon. They'll be charred at different levels. And when people invest in you, I'm aware that the primary thing is to invest in a cask. So single casks there's an explosion these days. Every retailer wants to have its own proprietary, single cask. Jews and Booze is single cask. We had in season 1, good friend of ours, Joshua Hatton, single cask nation, masters at it. On the whole, most of the time, they are a single cask. There is an art to that, to tasting and selecting and finding that the right moment to take it out of the barrel and put it in the bottle. There's also an incredible art that is beyond my understanding when people working in the major companies are blending multiple barrels. So you mentioned blending. Is that something that you're doing at First Cut as well, or are you primarily staying focused on the single barrel experience?
So the thing about single barrels is that they're a little bit more manageable for an individual or like an enthusiast, or if you're putting out a brand, you want to have a lot of volume. So in that case, you might want to do blends, but most enthusiasts are looking for something exclusive and one-off, and that's why the single barrel comes into play. But the truth is, you mentioned Joshua Hatton, and there's guys like him, Dave Schmier. I mean, both Jews, by the way. But there's none of this would exist without them doing it first. I mean, Josh Hatton started the Jewish whiskey company and Whiskey Jubilee. Dave Schmier sold Redemption Rye. I mean, these guys created this genre. And it's without them, I don't even know that any of this would have been possible. So I look to them as mentors.
Right. Wonderful. So how are you deciding where to select, where to source your barrels, what kind of barrels to offer? When people come and they might be interested in, I don't know, it could be a corporate thing, or it could be a Jewish community, a charity event. What are the ingredients that you are sourcing, and how are you making some of the choices about what are you offering to people who might be interested in purchasing a barrel?
Well, so the bottom line is we are never going to make something available that we would not want ourselves. So that's just the baseline. Moving on from there, most brands need to buy a lot of the same thing because they need to have consistency to put out a regular product on the shelves in a store. Since we're not aiming to put out a regular product in the shelves on the store, we don't have to buy 100 barrels of the same thing.
Mhm.
Instead, we'd rather buy 2 or 3 barrels of one thing, 2 or 3 of another thing, and try and have as big of a variety as possible. And so now we're exploring some single malts. We're exploring some different apple brandies, tequila, like blue agave spirit. There's the possibilities are endless if you're willing to have a wide variety of things. But at the end of the day, the baseline has to be, I would not want to sell it if I would not want to drink it myself.
Mm-hmm. Right. So tell us about what's sitting behind us, some of the specifics of what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so these barrels right here are 15-gallon, brand new American charred oak barrels, various char levels and toast levels. Charring a barrel is when you use high heat for a short amount of time. Toast is lower heat for a longer amount of time. They bring out different flavors in the barrel. And remember, with whiskey, all of the color and a lot of the flavor is actually coming from the charred barrel, not from the whiskey itself.
Right.
So these are 15-gallon barrels. Typically, you also see behind us here, these are 53-gallon barrels. These are really industry standard. But the thing about a 53-gallon barrel is you're talking about 200 plus bottles, depending on angel share and age and this kind of thing. It's a lot more than most people can take responsibility of. It's enough for a normal person to drink for their lifetime.
Right.
So we've, aside from the aged barrels, which were pretty much restricted to what people are putting out, we're also doing these smaller barrels that are brand new fill. So it's whiskey distillate like this, straight off the still, clear, unaged whiskey. So this is how whiskey looks before it goes in the barrel.
Right.
And we fill them up. The client picks the mash bill. The client picks the entry proof. And then they can pick any of the barrels we have available, different char levels, toast levels. These are all 15s, but we also do 30-gallon barrels over there and some 53-gallon barrels.
Right.
And those are much more manageable. For 2 years in a 15-gallon barrel, you're talking closer to 65 bottles.
Right. And 2 years is an important number because with bourbon, that's
the difference between a straight bourbon and just a regular bourbon.
right. Right. It has to be aged for a minimum length of time. I think, I've had a young bourbon. I have something at home that's from Texas that's about 2.5 years, and it was well on its way. It's not unusual though to find most bourbons being bottled around about the sort of 3 to 4 year sort of period of time. How are you guiding people who might say, I'm interested in this? You're going to guide me through, how the choices I make might influence my end result. How are you going to guide them through that? How long does it sit in the barrel for, piece of it?
Great question. So usually in the industry, it's a company that's putting out a product. And so for them, they have a financial interest in this being the widest possible market is interested in their product. For us, we're not putting out any product under our own name. Every barrel that we're aging belongs to a client. And so for us, there's less of that financial incentive to bottle. For a lot of distilleries, they bottle very early, sometimes too early, because they have to sell it. They have to make money so they can make more barrels. We don't have that problem because of our business model. So for us, it's all about the client. We send regular samples to the client, or the client can come visit us here in Stamford, Connecticut, and pull samples right out of the barrel of their own barrel themselves. So they decide when it's ready. Ultimately, it's whatever the client wants, whatever they think is the best whiskey is what we're going to bottle for them. Now, granted, a lot of people don't necessarily know a lot of the nuances of whiskey, and so we're here to help. We'll spot out different flavors. If it starts to get a little astringent or we think it's going to, maybe we'll recommend bottling sooner rather than later. But ultimately, it's the client's decision.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So tell us a little bit more. Is there something else that you wanted us to have a look at today that's part of the current offerings of First Cut?
Yeah. So this is another bourbon. This is a really special bourbon. I think this is really exciting. You don't see this very often. This is a straight Kentucky bourbon from a distillery called Lexington Distilling and Brewing. And what's special about this is, as you know, bourbon has to be 51% corn and a few other things. But the other grains you could play with.
Right.
Usually you're talking about a little bit higher rye content. But almost exclusively, you're talking about a very small smidge of malted barley.
Right. Usually, if you see it's like 4%, 5%, it's because it's just to get the enzymes moving,
exactly.
to get the distilling, the fermentation process going. But sometimes if you see something that's up like 8, 10, 12, then they're adding it for flavor. So what are we looking at here?
So yeah, that's why this is very cool. I like to think of this as a Scotch drinker's bourbon because it has such a high malted barley content. So on this one, it's 53% corn, so just a little bit over the threshold, 21% rye. So the same rye content as the MGP makes a low rye. bourbon. So it's also 21%. So that is not that unique. But what makes this really unique is the malted barley content is 26%, which is way higher than basically anything you're going to see in the U.S. And this is it was barreled September of 2016. So this is going to be 7 shortly, next couple of weeks.
Right.
I think that this barrel is fantastic, and this barrel is actually sitting right. This is it right here, right behind us.
So if folks are not in the business of taking new make spirit, the clear white stuff, and seeing what happens a few years later, is this something you're continuing to do? Are they able to taste things that you've already pre-selected and say, I'd like to buy into that?
Yeah. So obviously the big problem with whiskey is you got to wait, and a lot of people like myself don't want to wait. So if you don't want to wait, we do already aged barrels, and we try to match our clients' taste profiles, what they're looking for, with what's available.
Right.
And so it's something that we can definitely do. Not only that, we could bottle it as is, but we could also finish it in fun ways, whether it's in a honey barrel or a cherry brandy barrel or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that in just a little bit. But as you said, the standard barrel in most distilleries is this larger size. So it's immediate, but it's a larger commitment and investment.
Correct.
Because of the number of bottles you're going to get.
Correct.
Right. Well, let's give this a go. For fun. Yeah, that's getting sort of floral notes that I didn't get with the other two at all. The bourbon was very vanilla. The first one I got all of these wonderful rich spice notes.
I got on the first one. I got a lot of stone fruit, but this one's different. I mean, this is something special.
And I see why you describe it as the Scotch drinkers bourbon. Yes, it really does capture some of that.
I think people have this. People who are very into Scotch have an aversion to something super sweet, which is why they don't like bourbon.
Right. That's why I add the ice.
Right. But this has it's a nice balance. I think it gives you a little bit of the best of both worlds.
Yes. Yeah, it does.
For that.
Right. Right. There's probably not since back in the 80s when they started to make it through licensing possible for the micro distilleries to set up. Have we seen something that's really a brand new way of accessing whiskey, and we know how ground changing that was. The micro distilleries that started. I was at one of the first out in the North Shore of Boston a couple of years ago, and to see at the time that they were setting up. That they had maybe one or two others who were producing at the scale that they were trying to get started at. And everything was an experiment. They didn't know how to do anything. They didn't have degrees in chemistry. Everything was just learning and trying and dumping and trying again. And now we've got this enormous, incredible, diverse micro distillery world out there. Anywhere you go in the country, you can try whiskey that is trying to pick up something about the local flavor, the local story, and the same across the world as well. So, it's come a long way in the last, maybe 35, 40 years? It hasn't been that long.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a good segue to these Israeli whiskeys. So through Jews and Booze, I've been very fortunate enough to be able to try whiskeys from all around the world, really high-end exclusive whiskeys. And you would be very surprised to hear that, maybe not you, but most people would, that one of the top whiskey producers now is actually Israel. Israel's not known to have a culture or history of whiskey making, especially with such a hot climate. But they're doing it, and they're making some of the best whiskey in the world using what makes Israel not necessarily a great place for traditional whiskey. They're actually leaning into it and making it what makes Israeli whiskey Israeli. So, normally you'd get a Scotch and you'd want to age it 20 years or whatever it is. In Israel, certainly in Tel Aviv, where Milk and Honey is based, It's a hot climate, a hot, humid Mediterranean climate. You're not putting a whiskey in 20 years into a barrel.
Right.
Especially in Israel, you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. So you're not putting it for 20 years. So these actually were only barreled for three and change years. And because of the hot climate and because the color and a lot of the flavor is from the wood expanding and contracting, you get whiskey only three and change years old. That's this deep amber color. It's just a beautiful color. And again, no additives. And something very cool in Israel that's very unique is they are trying to make, they don't want to make whiskey in Israel. Anybody can do that. I can make whiskey anywhere, right? They want to make something that is Israeli whiskey. What makes Israeli whiskey Israeli whiskey? Much like the food in Israel, which is sort of a mishmash of all these different amazing cultures and cuisines and backgrounds, the same as whiskey. They're really adventurous, and maybe it speaks to the Israeli ethos. So I was very fortunate enough to be able to pick 2 barrels during COVID from Milk and Honey in Israel. They were shipped here on a cargo ship, but they're very, very unique. So this one is a pomegranate. It's a single malt whiskey, Scotch style, that was aged in a pomegranate wine cask that came from a winery in Israel. So all of the components, minus the barrel, came from Israel. Now, in Israel, there are oak trees. However, it's actually illegal to cut them down. It's a protected species. So there's no native barrel industry in Israel. So all the barrels are either coming from the US as ex-bourbon barrels,
Right.
or they're coming from Europe, either from wineries or whatever it is. These particular barrels actually came from Israeli wineries. So the wine itself was kosher. That sometimes is the sticking point between whiskey, for the most part, is kosher.
Right.
But the one thing that is the variable is any sort of grape involvement, or if there's any wine interaction or anything like that. So these actually were made using kosher Israeli wines. And it just kind of adds to that Israeli whiskey, not just whiskey from Israel. So it was really exciting. This one, a pomegranate wine cask. I don't know any other producer in the world that's doing anything like that.
No, and I know they do have a limited release of that in Israel. I think they were just advertising, if we get close to Rosh Hashanah, the High Holy Days, pomegranate wine cask makes a lot of sense. Pomegranates, New Year. But right, other than from the distillery itself, you really can't find this. This is pretty unique. Yeah.
So this is a single cask. This is actually the only single cask of this that they released in North America. So they put out a blended version in North America that's also very good, but not a single cask like this. This came straight out of the barrel, was labeled bottled for Jews and booze, and came straight to us. So it was exciting. And then the second one we did, I think, is even more exciting. It came from a white fortified wine cask. White fortified wine is actually white port.
Like, okay,
yeah, but port has to be made in Portugal.
Yes, so they can't call it that.
They can't call it port. It's made in Israel, so it's white fortified wine. I didn't even know there was such a thing as white fortified wine. It was just delicious. And this is actually they got 2 barrels of this. One they kept in the distillery in-house, and the other one I got. So this is the only one outside of Israel. It's pretty cool.
Right. Well, so Josh, I know that our focus today has been on this brand new initiative, First Barrel Company, and it's really First Cut. It's really been an education to just see what's involved in a startup, essentially.
For me too.
Taking something that is a journey from, I've never tasted whiskey, to I won a good whiskey in a raffle, to I got into it, to I started, purchasing and distributing and my own single barrel labels, and now this.
I'll tell you what, I am the luckiest guy in the world. I get to work in my passion. Nobody ever leaves here without a smile on their face. It's unlike any other job.
Right.
And I get to work with my brother every day, which is a blessing.
Which is wonderful. So I know that in terms of some things that are a little different, you've got something else to share. And I was involved a little earlier in pouring directly from the barrel my own sample over here, which we're, I think, saving to last, or is that going to go next?
Yeah, let's do this one next.
Okay.
So this is really, really special. This is a 99% corn bourbon, so a little heavy on the corn. came from MGP in Indiana, 7.5 years old. We took the barrel of whiskey, and then I bought separately a barrel that originally held bourbon from Jim Beam. Whoever, I guess Jim Beam bottled it, dumped it. They sold the barrel to a brandy distillery in California. That brandy distillery filled it with cherry brandy. It sat for, I believe, almost 4 years. Then they dumped it, they bottled their brandy, sold it, and then we bought the empty barrel. I took it and filled it with this 7.5-year-old 99% corn bourbon from Indiana. So it was only a week ago. So you probably are not getting the full effect of the finished flavor. When we opened the barrel, the whole room smelled like Luden's cherry cough drops. It was amazing.
Pretty intense.
So I don't know. We'll see if you could pick out any of those notes from this, but think of it as this is a work in progress.
Okay. Oh, fine. Oh, there's no question. I mean, on the nose.
On the nose, yeah.
It's there. It's not. It's there, but it's not medicinal. Yeah, to just sort of, I mean, sometimes bourbons have, as part of just their natural, what they've picked up from barrels and where do they be made, people will describe the cherry notes, or dark forest, fruit notes that come with the final product of a bourbon. But yeah, there's a brightness to that aspect here that you're picking up. Yeah, I mean, oftentimes when people finish in a barrel, it doesn't sit in that barrel for a super long time. It could be, a couple of months and it's done. Based on 1 week, I'm thinking, you might not want to have that in there too long before
we're gonna keep
becomes
picking this one out to make sure it's not
super
too much.
intense. That's right. But that's
really part of the risk. That's part of the risk. I mean, you get to be creative, but within limits, because at some point it's no longer going to be palatable.
Right. If you hadn't told me what it was finished in, that cherry lozenge type element is so prevalent that I would like to think I might have identified a flavor. I probably would not have been able to tell you the barrel because it might not have occurred to me that someone was making cherry brandy and that's what you were using. I have a question. We've had different mash bills. You have a mash bill here that you said was how much corn? 90?
This is 99% corn, 1% malted barley.
Right, which is pretty unusual.
Yeah.
99% corn. How did you decide I'm going to marry that with this barrel? What's the process?
So I've done a bunch of these Jews and Booze barrels before, and some of my most successful barrels, the ones that I thought were the tastiest, but also the ones that people in the group liked the most, and I've experimented quite a bit, were the 99% corn bourbons that were between 7 and 8 years old. That I was finishing at the time I was doing a few honey barrels. So it was a barrel that held bourbon, was dumped. I filled it up with wildflower honey. Boston Honey Company is where I was getting the honey in Holliston. And we dumped out the honey after a little while, and then we filled it back up with the whiskey. And it just, I don't know, for some reason, they just blended together. It tasted phenomenal. I mean, it really gave like, it didn't feel artificial. It really felt like a natural, it was just very good. And I wanted to keep experimenting with that mash bill.
Wow. Yeah. Because I think of corn as being the piece of the bourbon that adds the sweetness component. It would never occur to me, oh, let's put that in an ex-honey barrel. That, just like feels to me you're ramping that up. But I know honey actually is not just intense sweetness. It's a lot of other notes, and sometimes has a little bitterness, sometimes has a lot of floral notes to it. There's a lot else going on beyond just our association with honey is sweet.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't have been something I would have thought of.
Yeah. I mean, so what we did, like we tried to do, the problem is to do this, it's a big investment. A lot of honey is crazy expensive, and a big barrel and whiskey, and there's a lot of risk. If you ruin it, it's thousands of dollars down the drain. So we tried to approximate what it might look like. So there was a lot of little glasses with a little drop of honey and different mash bills. And I can't say that it's a perfect science, but we tried as best possible to figure out what would be the best combination.
Before you committed. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Have you ever had an experiment where you went, oh, I bombed. This one didn't work.
I wouldn't say bombed, but definitely there were some that were better than others. We did an apple brandy finish that you didn't get a ton of the apple, which is what I was kind of hoping for. It wasn't bad. It just wasn't quite as good as I was hoping for.
Right.
I don't know if it was because I took it out too early, or maybe they just didn't, the mash bill just didn't go with the apple brandy barrel that well. But it was good, but not my favorite.
Right. But at this point, you've got quite a few single barrels under your belt to have some experience to draw on.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean like they're all going to be hits. Again, a big part of the fun is being able to experiment.
Right.
And if you don't have failures, then you can't appreciate the successes.
That is true. That is true. Well, this is something that I'm very interested to see how this ends up when you decide it's ready to completely pull out of the barrel. But it's a great start.
And if anybody is interested, this is the name of this barrel is going to be the Barrel Bachor. It's going to be a take on the Bachelorette, the show. So stay tuned for that one.
So that's going to be a new Jews and Booze release.
That will be a Jews and Booze release. Yeah.
Okay.
Whenever we're ready, probably in a few months.
Okay. And we're back in Jews and Booze land.
We are back in Jews and Booze land. One more. Now this, I'm not going to tell you what it is. Let's see if you can just by tasting and see. So there's 3 different factors on this one: age, proof, and type of whiskey. And you may want to use a couple drops of water on this one.
Right.
But right off the bat, you can see this one is significantly lighter than the others.
Yes. Yes. And actually, I know I'm going to want to add water because getting a big hit of just alcohol.
Yeah. I mean, this one's strong. Yeah. This is the strongest one we've tried. This one might be the strongest whiskey you've ever tried.
I hope we're not quite in hand sanitizer territory.
Well, so
Put me out of my misery.
I'll tell you right off the bat, this is not a brand new charred oak barrel. So that's what the color is from. It's an ex-bourbon barrel.
Okay.
So that's the lighter color. And that's why you're getting much more floral notes instead of like butterscotch or, strong, more bourbon notes, things like that. Although the mash bill on this is 97% corn.
That's that sweetness. Because
exactly.
I could feel that was there,
yeah.
but right, there's something that's cutting right through that.
Oh yeah.
Right.
So this is 97% corn, 2.7% rye, 0.3% malted barley.
Wow. So just the barest minimum to just kickstart that process.
And I'll tell you, this was distilled in Alberta, Canada. So this is a Canadian whiskey.
Okay.
And it was distilled by a distillery called Black Velvet. Mm-hmm. That was it ended up getting bought out by Heaven Hill, which, as we know, is the Shapiro family. Is
good Jewish company. It's
they're very good benefactors to the community and
wonderful
good
products.
people. Yeah. So this is owned by Heaven Hill now. And do you want to know the proof? What do you think the proof is?
Well, I know I had to add water. I mean,
it's definitely
I will tell you that the hit that I got out of it is a little bit like the first time I opened the M&H with a pomegranate cask, which you had at original cask strength, which I think is like what you got it up at 64, is it? It's
64. Sorry, the pomegranate was 66.3.
60, right? Which is even. I mean, I've had. I'm somebody who enjoys Bookers. I can see you've got some ex-Bookers there. So I've had, bourbons in this country up at that proof. That's usually where I have the slow dissolving, ice to just kind of like gently add the water in to bring it down. This feels that it is at least that.
Now, what's interesting about bourbon? More than that. Bourbon the maximum that it can go in the barrel is 125.
Right.
If you want to call it bourbon, it can't go in higher than 125.
Yep.
So that kind of puts a ceiling on how high the proof can go. I mean, it's just the way it is.
Right.
Canadian whiskey doesn't have that same restriction.
Okay. So, right, because that's right. So something can go, you might have to add water in the US before it can go in the barrel if you need to bring the proof down a little bit. But then evaporation and so on, it could rise up again. So, but Canada has no restriction or doesn't have that restriction?
Well, it doesn't have that restriction. I mean,
Okay.
there's Canada is much looser when it comes to restrictions on their whiskey. So one of the reasons why a lot of people have an aversion to Canadian whiskey is that legally there's a small percentage that you don't have to disclose what it is. So it could be like 99% grains that we're aware of, but 1%, I don't remember exactly what the percentage is, but let's say 1% port or 1% some other wine
Right.
that they don't have to disclose. Now, one of the things I've learned in doing this whole thing is that the more transparent, the more details, the more specifications you could provide, the more interesting it is. Because the fun part about whiskey is comparing. But if you don't know what's in it, how are you supposed to compare? That's why I think a lot of people have an aversion to Canadian whiskey. This whiskey, we know what's in it. There's no question. Yeah, but other than that, it's very loose as far as what the rules are.
So the big reveal, what is the proof on this?
The proof on this is 171.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. I mean, it definitely drinks hot, but I don't think 171 hot.
So this is,
And it'll be 23 years old in December. So this was barreled in December of 2000.
it's very unique. And this is going to be a Jews and Booze release?
Yeah, so this is the very next Jews and Booze release, and stay tuned. It's going to be called the Altar Cocker.
Wow. Well, that is definitely a unique taste. And this has been an education. And as you said, the opportunity, if people are interested, when I run the credits at the end, we'll provide all the information for how people can find you. But this is part of the experience. This is part of the experience to be able to taste and compare and to know what you're choosing and what you like. I wish you a lot of luck with the venture.
Thank you so much.
May it be a successful 5,784 and beyond.
Thank you so much.
L'chaim. Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed this on-location exploration of the making of whiskey and the sourcing of whiskey. As I always do, if you want to learn more about Jews and Booze or about First Cut Barrel Company, all of the information will be in the notes that accompany this episode, whether you're listening to the audio version or whether you are watching us on YouTube. And I'm looking forward to all of those other guests that are coming up this season. I am still recruiting for the second half of the season. As always, I would love to hear from you. If you are somebody working in the whiskey world who happens to be Jewish, or if you are working anywhere in the world. So you see, we're going to be interviewing someone from Belarus this season. I would love to hear from you as well. We'll talk a little whiskey, but then we can talk about the work that you do and learn something about the Jewish world where you are. So please be in touch. You can find me at my website, rabbirg.com. Until next month, I want to wish everyone a Shana Tova, a good new year, and L'chaim.